on those in our other stories when relevant. As always, a link to all sources used will be down in the description. We now return to the place that God forgot about, the Middle East. The war between Israel and Hamas still rages within the confines of Gaza. And unfortunately, there isn't much on the ground that doesn't sound like we just copy-pasted a script from any time over the last year. On the 2nd of this month, UNICEF reported that over 50 children were killed in airstrikes within the city of Jabalia over just 2 days. 2 days later, another airstrike in Beit Lahia would go on to kill at least 20 people, an incident which shouldn't be confused with another airstrike that hit the same area the week before, killing 93 people. This was just the first few days of the month, but sadly, if we actually mentioned every individual airstrike, we probably wouldn't have time for anything else. In even worse news, aid within Gaza has dropped to an 11-month low. Over the previous month of October, 57 aid trucks were allowed to cross into Gaza per day, a figure which was much lower than the 350 demanded by the US and the 600 which was recommended by aid agencies. Getting aid into civilian hands has become especially dangerous, time-consuming and fraught with red tape. And according to aid agencies, Israeli authorities either denied or impeded 58% of all aid movements. On top of this, UN officials state that a third of all aid brought into Gaza is either stolen by criminals to be resold far above market value or taken by Hamas. Although the International Court of Justice is still examining whether Israel's assault into Gaza constitutes a genocide, there are certainly a lot of signs pointing in that direction. According to a report published by a UN Special Committee this month, Israel's conduct within Gaza is consistent with the characteristics of genocide. The report states, quote, "Since the beginning of the war, Israeli officials have publicly supported policies that strip Palestinians of the very necessities required to sustain life: food, water, and fuel. These statements, along with the systematic and unlawful interference of humanitarian aid, make clear Israel's intent to instrumentalize life-saving supplies for political and military gains." End quote. The United States, Israel's closest ally, has repeatedly stated that it would cut off military aid if humanitarian conditions within Gaza don't improve. In fact, US law dictates that weapons shipments are to be cut off to any nation who block the delivery of US aid. However, these threats have consistently proven toothless, as Israel has regularly not met the demands of the United States. Speaking of the United States, as we previously mentioned, the nation is set to once again welcome former and future President Donald Trump back into office, who of course will play a significant role in shaping Middle Eastern foreign policy. Mr. Trump's specific policies aren't entirely clear. However, his previous time in office saw US-Israel relations especially strengthened. His previous term moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem, recognized the occupied Golan Heights as Israeli territory, and in 2019, the Trump administration declared that Israeli settlements were not illegal under international law. Trump's nominee for ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, also seems to share similar sentiments, having a long history of voicing support for the expansion of Israeli territory. President-elect Trump also appointed Steve Witkoff to serve as his special envoy to the Middle East, and earlier this year, Witkoff commented on Trump's previous time in office with, quote, "With President Trump, the Middle East experienced historic levels of peace and stability. Strength prevents wars. Iran's money was cut off, which prevented their funding of global terror." End quote. We couldn't find any history of Witkoff's experience as a diplomat, as he's a real estate investor by trade. However, he does seem to have quite the close relationship with President Trump. So close, in fact, that he was present during his attempted golf course assassination earlier in September. In the first presidential debate back in June, Trump stated that the United States should, quote, "let them, Israel, go and let them finish the job." Whether the relationship between the US and Israel will change between now and when Mr. Trump once again assumes power remains to be seen. However, viewers probably shouldn't expect any drastic measures in the twilight hours of Biden's administration. At this point, we should probably remember that Israel is also at war with Hezbollah, a faction which acts as a de facto government within many parts of neighboring Lebanon. The Israel-Lebanon conflict tends to generate pretty similar headlines to the ones we mentioned within Gaza, with tens of thousands being killed every few days via rocket attacks. However, in this case, Hezbollah has proven to be much more formidable in its retaliation efforts. Instead of listing these specific incidents which can admittedly leave people pretty desensitized, we wanted to take a snapshot of this conflict from the perspective of people within the country. We were lucky enough to speak to a student from northern Lebanon, a person we'll just call Jim. On the other hand, we once again talked to IDF tanker Sergeant Daniel, who's been on the ground within Lebanon since the start of Israel's incursion. To start with our student, Jim told us that he was from the northern city of Batroun, a place which he told us had been spared from much of the war. Despite this, he mentioned that the city itself has become overwhelmed with refugees fleeing from the south, meaning a lot of public schools have been repurposed to house the influx of people. Jim also mentioned that Lebanon's economy has been suffering even more than usual, as this most recent conflict comes after 3 years of financial meltdown within the country. A World Bank report released in the middle of this month estimated that the war had already come to an economic cost of $8.5 billion US, and that 875,000 people have been internally displaced within the country. We wanted to know if Jim had any questions to ask Sergeant Daniel directly, to which he had two. His first question was, how do you feel about the number of civilian deaths? I know very well that they, Hezbollah, use people like meat shields, but is the amount of civilians versus combatants worth it? When we passed this on to Sergeant Daniel, he would first preface his answer to say that it was his personal opinion, and not representative of the Israeli Defense Force or the wider Israeli government. In a fairly long response, he would reply, quote, "I'll keep it simple. It's horrible. It always is. In war, ultimately, the people who suffer the most on both sides are the civilians. In a war, it's hard to think about the other side, especially when yourself have been hurt somehow. But I always try to keep it in mind. And yes, like he, Jim, said, the enemies we're fighting are doing their all to make this as difficult as they can for us, using human shields, hiding weapons and ammo stockpiles in hospitals and schools, and preventing evacuations. Now, is it worth it? I can't tell you. I will never have an answer to that. I don't think anyone at this time will. History will say if it was worth it, but we do what must be done. Our entry into Lebanon revealed enormous stockpiles of weapons, command posts, ambush sites, and many other instruments of war, all presumably prepared to launch an invasion into North Israel, similar to the 7 October attack and massacre by Hamas, but probably much bigger and worse. So we could leave Lebanon alone and let Hezbollah do its thing, and then we'd pay an incalculable price. But we can't, because that's what you must do. You have to first and foremost protect your people and country, and unfortunately when you do that, people get hurt. But we still try all we can to minimize civilian casualties. Leaflets, personal calls, hacking broadcasts to urge people to evacuate from places and buildings that are going to get struck. We truly do our best, but obviously sometimes your best isn't enough. Our current mission objective in Lebanon is to make it so that the civilians of Israel can never again be threatened by Hezbollah. And we'll do what's necessary to achieve that, because we owe it to them. End quote. We also wanted to ask about Israel's targeting of civilian infrastructure, and whether all the buildings hit are genuinely valid military targets. Sergeant Daniel would once again reply, quote, "My answer is quite similar. It's terrible that civilian infrastructure is targeted, but again, unfortunately, Hezbollah isn't giving us any choice. Like I said before, they purposely put their rockets, weapons, and ammo under civilian infrastructure. We can't just ignore it. It's so horrible, and it looks and sounds horrible. But we must. But again, we do our best to minimize civilian harm. I don't know regarding the cities in the north or the validity of targets. Again, I'm not involved in it in any way. My answer will be obvious, but from what I know, we only strike valid targets. We don't decimate buildings for fun. We strike places which intel led us to believe contain either terrorists, weapons, or both. And I personally hope that this happens only after we did all we could to get the uninvolved out. So in short, I believe and hope all targets struck are valid targets. This is all I can really say from my perspective. But again, even though I'm a soldier operating in Lebanon right now, I'm pretty much not involved at all in what he, Jim, is really asking about. So this all might as well be from a civilian." End quote. Jim goes on to describe why he thinks Israel would likely exacerbate further violence within the region. As he explains, although Hezbollah isn't the Lebanese government, it basically functions like a government within much of southern Lebanon. For many civilians, Hezbollah provides food, shelter, money, education, and welfare. So from their perspective, Israel isn't just weeding out a terrorist organization, they're crossing the border to attack their own government. Jim explains that this isn't just a fringe view within Lebanon either, as many Lebanese politicians echo this sentiment. Despite this, Jim tells us that there appears to be quite a divide within the nation, with support for Hezbollah being far more entrenched in the south, while the citizens in the north are likely to be more critical of the group. Jim believes that the reason Hezbollah was able to become so powerful in the first place is due to the rampant corruption within Lebanon. As he explains, quote, "The rise of Hezbollah was not just in one night. Hezbollah is a military, resistant force. Their entry into politics is not acceptable. So how did they allow for such people to join? Every major political party abandoned their weapon, but not Hezbollah. Yet they still recognize Hezbollah. They still let Hezbollah participate in politics, distribute weapons, and build bunkers. Do you think all of this happened without a lot of people turning a blind eye? Not everyone is so corrupt, but a majority are. To be honest, it isn't just the government which is corrupt, but also the people themselves. When people only vote for the representatives to get a job, aid, or money, that's when you know people are corrupt." End quote. Jim also told us that some of his own family members have been trying for 5 years to have their national IDs replaced, and were only helped when they promised to vote for a specific person. He would also mention that any aid into Lebanon from US or UN food packages would be worthless without proper distribution, as he had witnessed people steal the aid to be sold for profit. Something that we noticed, at least anecdotally, is that both Jim and Daniel seem to be moderate in their political views. Jim clearly condemned both sides for conflict, seeing Israel as a foreign power unnecessarily hitting civilian targets, and Hezbollah as a puppet of Iran, which has brought nothing but misery to Lebanon. On the other hand, Sergeant Daniel has never given us the impression that he's a dispassionate soldier. Daniel has been a contact for the channel for over a year, and he's constantly made it very clear that he has very little love for Benjamin Netanyahu's government. From his perspective, Hezbollah has very obviously been ramping up for another October 7th style attack. So Israel's push into Lebanon is just an unfortunate act of self-defense. It's easy to think that these wars are relatively binary, but in our experience, these more moderate views are way more common than viewers might expect. There are millions of people caught up in a conflict they don't want any part of, seemingly held hostage by relatively small groups of extremists on either side. Even before the war, Lebanon's government was suffering very low approval metrics. Israel had seen some of the largest protests in
Get me the fuck out of here,
hasn't
bro.
actually won an election since 2006. It may just be our anecdotal experience,
Get me the
but we
fuck
suspect
outta
that
here,
most
dog.
people in the region don't care about expanding their borders
Fuck
or wiping
this
out their
boss.
neighbors,
Oh, God,
and
oh,
simply
God,
want
oh,
to be left alone in peace. We can only hope
Oh,
they get
God,
this
oh,
in their
God.
lifetime. That was supposed to be the end of the story, but just days before the
Cool
end of the
build, though,
month,
but
a ceasefire
fuck
agreement
me.
was struck.
Shut the fuck up. Thank you. Jesus Christ. Alright. Watch news without the bullshit. Fucking goated background noise. Alright. Boys and good.